Something explosive allegedly unfolded at the very heart of the royal household. Prince William reportedly ended a call with Queen Camilla mid-conversation, after a confrontation over the removal of Tom Parker Bowles from a royal estate. And that's not even the most unsettling part. What started as a private grievance between family members has since spiraled into something nobody saw coming, touching raw nerves around authority, loyalty, and where the true lines of royal power actually sit. The public remains split. Supporters of William say he had no choice. Critics say the response went too far. So the question that keeps surfacing is this: was William right to end that call without warning? Or did something far more complicated push him past the point of no return? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Like, subscribe, and stay right here, because where this story goes next is not what anyone expected. The moment everything began wasn't the argument. It was a phone that went dead. Reports indicate that Camilla had already learned her son, Tom Parker Bowles, had been removed from a royal estate in a decision reportedly connected to estate management and oversight. For most royal watchers, the removal alone would have been enough of a story. But the moment that followed, the reported confrontation, the rising tension, and then William cutting the line, that became the story everyone couldn't stop talking about. Camilla, by all accounts, was not prepared to let the situation sit. She wasn't going to wait for a palace statement or a quiet resolution behind closed doors. She went straight to William. That in itself told observers everything about how seriously she was taking this. William, for his part, reportedly had no intention of unraveling a decision that had already been carried out. He had a position. He held it. And then, abruptly, the call was over. That silence, the sudden absence of a voice on the other end of the line, became a moment that landed harder than most expected. Some called it decisive. Others called it a rupture. Because an ending that abrupt doesn't just close a conversation. It opens 1,000 questions about what was actually being said before the line dropped. What piece of information convinced William there was nothing left to discuss? Who had pushed events to the edge before the call even started? And once that line went dead, was a larger confrontation already quietly beginning? Keep watching. Long before that phone call became the headline, a different kind of tension had already been building. The estate removal at the center of this story didn't appear out of nowhere. According to accounts surrounding the situation, concerns had been circulating for some time before any formal action was taken. Concerns about whether certain activities connected to Tom Parker Bowles had been properly cleared, whether access to specific areas of the estate had been appropriately authorized, and whether procedures that were meant to apply consistently had actually been followed in this case. Estate managers, it seems, found themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position. The kinds of questions they were being asked to answer weren't simple ones. Authorization, access, oversight, these are words that don't stay quiet inside an institution where reputation is treated as infrastructure. As the review process continued, the situation grew more visible than many would have preferred. What had started as an internal matter was attracting attention from wider administrative circles. And with that attention came pressure. The more closely the situation was examined, the more pressure mounted to come to a decision. Supporters of Tom might have read the scrutiny as disproportionate, a private individual being held to an unusually strict standard because of who he was connected to. Others saw it differently, that the standard was being applied regardless of connection, which was precisely the point. When estate officials eventually reached a conclusion, the outcome was removal. Whether that outcome felt justified or excessive depended entirely on where you stood. But once it was carried out, the matter stopped being administrative. It became personal. And personal matters, inside royal circles, have a way of becoming something much larger than the original decision. The estate incident didn't close the story. It lit the fuse. Which raises the real question: if the removal was simply the beginning, what discovery turned a manageable disagreement into a collision course? Who made the first call that changed everything? And once an unexpected response arrived, what did it expose that nobody inside the palace wanted surfaced? Stay close. By the time the removal was done, this had stopped being about property access. William's reported refusal to revisit the decision, to simply reopen what had already been concluded, signaled to observers that something more substantial was at stake. For a future king, every decision touching royal estates, institutional reputation, or public trust carries weight beyond the immediate circumstance. The concern, reportedly, wasn't just what had happened. It was what allowing it to pass unchallenged would communicate going forward. If questions were raised, reviewed, and then quietly set aside because of personal relationships, the message sent to everyone managing royal assets would be unmistakable, that the rules bend under the right circumstances. William, according to people familiar with the situation, was not willing to send that message. Behind the scenes, senior advisors were engaged in conversations about precedent. Not about Tom Parker Bowles specifically, but about what exception-making in one case invites in every case that follows. Institutions that absorb pressure quietly often find that the pressure simply builds somewhere else. Acting carried risk, family tension, public scrutiny, the appearance of rigidity. Not acting carried a different kind of risk, the slow erosion of the very standards that give the institution credibility. Neither path was clean. Neither came without consequences. Interpretations divided quickly. Those who read William's position as institutional consistency found it defensible, even admirable, a future monarch prioritizing the long view over short-term comfort. Those who read it differently found it cold, or unnecessarily escalatory. What everyone agreed on was that William appeared to have reached a decision and was not going back. One estate dispute had quietly transformed into a test of principle. And the results of that test were only beginning to ripple outward. Which brings the next question into focus: what specific warning convinced William this dispute had stakes beyond what it appeared? Whose voice in his ear shaped the next move? And when the line was finally drawn, who found themselves standing on the wrong side of it? Keep watching. Camilla's response changed the temperature of everything. The removal of Tom Parker Bowles from a royal estate was never going to sit quietly, not when the person removed was her son. What the situation had looked like from an administrative perspective and what it felt like from a mother's perspective were two entirely different experiences. And according to reports, Camilla was not inclined to let the distance between those two perspectives go unaddressed. Inside royal circles, the fallout began accumulating. There were concerns about headlines, about the story escaping the internal conversation and becoming a public one. Some felt the matter needed to be absorbed discreetly, without further escalation. Others believed that once the decision had been made and communicated, there was no longer any path to quiet resolution. Opinions had calcified. Camilla, by many accounts, questioned whether Tom had been treated proportionately. Whether the level of response matched the actual severity of the concern. Whether, if the circumstances had involved someone with different connections, the outcome would have been the same. Those are not simple questions, and they weren't receiving simple answers. On the other side, those who stood behind the decision argued that revisiting it was precisely the wrong move. That allowing personal loyalty to override institutional process was the very pattern the decision had been designed to prevent. Relationships and responsibilities were being asked to occupy the same space, and they were not fitting. Every attempt to ease the tension seemed to sharpen it. Conversations that were meant to find middle ground instead kept circling back to the same unresolved fault line: when family and duty conflict, which one wins? Nobody was prepared to concede. And as the impasse deepened, observers began reading the dispute as something bigger than its immediate circumstances, a window into how accountability and loyalty interact at the very center of royal life. The stakes, quietly, were rising. And the person positioned at the center of it all was about to make the decision that would define how the story was remembered. Which leads to the next layer: what unseen pressure was feeding the resistance? Who stood to gain from tensions escalating further? And when the relationship cost became unavoidable, who ended up paying it? Stay with us. Something was moving through palace corridors that couldn't quite be named. Not the dispute itself, but the atmosphere it was creating. What had started as a disagreement over one man's removal from a royal estate had become a story that senior figures were tracking with increasing attention. The original incident was still the reference point, but it was no longer the actual subject. The actual subject was what the incident had revealed and what it might trigger next. Inside royal circles, quiet conversations were happening. Not public statements. Not official responses. The kind of low register, behind closed doors discussion that institutions fall back on when a situation starts developing its own momentum. Some people believed the removal had been handled correctly and that the real problem was the escalation that followed. Others worried that the scrutiny attached to the situation could grow harder to manage the longer it stayed unresolved. There were no easy answers on offer, only trade-offs. Public perception was a growing part of the calculation. Controversies inside royal families rarely behave the way institutions want them to. Once a story reaches a certain level of public visibility, the original facts start to compete with interpretation, reaction, and speculation, and often lose. The concern wasn't only about what had happened. It was about what the story would become in the hands of people outside palace walls. Every day the situation remained unsettled was another day that narrative could drift in an unwanted direction. Senior figures found themselves weighing outcomes that all carried some form of cost. Would attention fade naturally over time? Or would silence itself be read as confirmation of something more serious? Could the relationships that had been strained by the dispute recover without some formal acknowledgement of what had gone wrong? The questions didn't resolve themselves. And in that absence of resolution, speculation moved in to fill the space. Versions of events began circulating, some emphasizing William's decisiveness, others foregrounding Camilla's grievance, still others suggesting the dispute was simply the visible surface of a much older and deeper tension. What made this moment genuinely significant wasn't the estate incident. It was the fact that the estate incident had cracked something open, something about authority, trust, and the question of who, in practice, holds the power to define how royal institutions behave. The consequences of that question had not yet fully arrived. But they were coming. And the most important decisions hadn't been made yet. Which means the real mystery was still forming: who was guiding the conversation from the inside? Which figures were most afraid of what the fallout could cost them? And when private tensions finally broke into the open, what would the decision that emerged from that breaking point actually look like? Stay tuned. This story had long since stopped being about a phone call. What the reported confrontation between William and Camilla had done it quietly, without anyone quite intending it, was attach itself to a much larger question about where the monarchy was heading. The removal from the estate, the reported resistance to revisiting it, the abrupt end of a conversation that hadn't reached a conclusion, these individual moments had accumulated into something with symbolic weight. Observers who had been watching William's decisions over time found themselves reading this episode through that lens. A future king who reportedly refused to reverse a decision made on principle, even when the personal cost was evident, was being evaluated not just for what he did in this specific situation but for what the decision suggested about how he might one day lead. Some found that read compelling. A monarchy that modernizes its relationship with accountability, that applies its standards without adjusting them based on who's in the room, had real appeal to audiences who had grown skeptical of institutional double standards. Others pushed back. They questioned whether a harder line in moments like this created unnecessary damage to the relationships that make institutions function. Tradition and adaptation don't always move in the same direction, and the pressure to balance them only intensifies as the institution evolves. Generational differences surfaced as part of the conversation. Every era of the monarchy has had to decide what to preserve and what to revise, which inherited practices still serve their purpose and which have become obstacles to earning public trust in a changed world. The estate dispute, rightly or wrongly, had pulled that ongoing question into sudden focus. And the more observers talked about it, the more the conversation revealed how much genuine disagreement exists about which direction the institution should move. What remained stubbornly unresolved was whether this episode would eventually be read as a defining moment or simply a difficult chapter. Whether William's reported position would be remembered as a turning point or recalibrated in the context of whatever came next. With William holding to one vision and the weight of older expectations pressing back, the question that no one could quite answer was this: right now, in this moment, what actually determines which direction the monarchy moves? And who has the real authority to decide what stays and what doesn't? Let's keep pulling on that thread. The call ended. The conversation didn't. Even after the line went silent, the questions that had been raised inside that exchange kept moving through the spaces around it, through royal circles, through public discussion, through the people paying attention to what the incident might actually mean. Tom Parker Bowles's removal from the estate had been the spark. But by the time this story reached its most discussed phase, the removal was almost incidental. What people were actually debating was something harder to pin down: the relationship between William and Camilla, the pressures that had shaped their respective positions, and what the episode had exposed about the fault lines running through the institution they both occupied. William's reported unwillingness to revisit the outcome struck different observers in entirely different ways. Those who read it as principle found something admirable: a future king absorbing personal friction rather than letting personal relationships override an institutional decision. Those who read it differently found something troubling: a willingness to let a confrontation end without any resolution, without apparent concern for what that ending cost. Camilla's position drew its own divided response. The argument that a mother defending her son was doing something human and understandable, that her reaction was feeling, not strategy, had genuine resonance. But the counter-argument, that interventions of that kind are exactly what established processes are designed to withstand, had its own logic. Neither side was obviously wrong. Both sides kept talking. The wider royal family hovered in the background of public attention. Disagreements inside institutions rarely stay as private as institutions would prefer, and this one had clearly traveled. Questions about unity, about whether what had emerged in this episode was an isolated spike in tension or evidence of something more persistent, didn't dissolve when the headlines moved on. They stayed, just below the surface, informing how observers read the next set of decisions and the ones after that. What the dispute ultimately opened up wasn't a conclusion. It was a long question. About what the relationship between William and Camilla looks like from here. About whether the estate controversy was a singular moment or a preview of dynamics that would keep returning. The original conflict may have faded from the front page. But the things that had surfaced, about authority, about loyalty, about where those two forces meet and what happens when they collide, those weren't going anywhere. So here's what it comes down to: was William right to hold his ground, or should the weight of family have changed the calculation? Tell us what you think in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe, because this story isn't over yet.